A man reached out to save a helpless blind bobcat kitten, never imagining how this act of compassion would change his life forever. The rescue seemed like a simple kindness, but fate had woven an extraordinary twist that would reveal itself with the dawn. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The wind screamed through the Montana mountains like a wounded animal, shaking the windows of John Smith's lonely cabin with violent gusts that threatened to tear the weathered structure from its foundation. Outside, ancient pines bent and groaned under the assault, their shadows dancing frantically across the walls whenever lightning split the sky. John sat hunched in his battered armchair, the one his wife had reupholstered twice before her passing 3 years ago, its worn fabric carrying memories his calloused fingers occasionally traced when he thought no one was watching. The glow of the fire flickered over his weathered face, illuminating the network of lines etched by 48 years of Montana winters and the deeper scars left by years of solitude. His eyes, once bright with purpose, now carried the dull sheen of a man who had retreated from the world. The cabin, once filled with laughter and plans for the future, had become a fortress against everything he'd lost. Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the collection of faded photographs on the mantelpiece, frozen moments of a happier life. John stared into his cold coffee, the black liquid reflecting his haggard expression. He hadn't bothered to reheat it. The bitter taste matched his mood tonight. The silence inside pressed on him like a physical weight, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace and the relentless drumming of rain against the roof. The retired outdoorsman pulled his flannel shirt tighter around his broad shoulders, a futile gesture against the chill that seemed to come from within rather than without. 3 years in this self-imposed exile had taught him to embrace the emptiness, to find comfort in expecting nothing. Tonight, however, the storm's fury made the cabin feel smaller, the walls closing in with each thunderclap. John rose to add another log to the dying fire, his movements mechanical and precise. The routine had become a lifeline. Wake, eat, maintain the cabin, sleep, repeat. No complications, no disappointments, no one to fail or be failed by. Just as he settled back into his chair, something changed. Amid the raging storm, a sound cut through the darkness, faint, desperate, and unmistakably alive. A cry that made his heart skip a beat. John froze, coffee mug suspended halfway to his lips, listening intently. There it was again, weak but distinct, coming from somewhere beyond his porch. The sound pierced through years of carefully constructed indifference. It wasn't human, but it carried a primal urgency that resonated in his chest. Something was out there, fighting to survive against impossible odds. Something that wouldn't last the night without help. John set down his mug, surprising himself with how quickly he moved toward the door. At first, John Smith thought it was the wind tormenting him, playing tricks on his mind after years of solitude in the Montana wilderness. He'd grown accustomed to the mountain's strange sounds, the way the pines creaked and moaned during storms, how the wind seemed to whisper through the cracks of his aging cabin. But this sound was different. It came again, weak and pleading, cutting through the thunder with a desperation that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The retired outdoorsman set down his cold coffee and listened intently. There it was again, unmistakably a cry for help. John pulled his heavy raincoat from the hook by the door, its waterproof fabric stiff from disuse. He grabbed his flashlight, testing the batteries with a quick flick before stepping onto the wooden porch. The storm hit him like a physical blow. Rain lashed sideways, driven by winds that bent the tall pines surrounding his property. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating the flooded landscape before plunging it back into darkness. John pulled his coat tighter and descended the porch steps, his boots immediately sinking into the sodden earth. The cry came again, louder now that he was outside. Something was in trouble down by the creek, the same creek where he and his wife had once spent peaceful summer afternoons before illness had taken her. John trudged forward, guided by another plaintive wail that seemed to tug at something long dormant inside him. The normally gentle creek had transformed into a churning torrent, swollen with rainwater rushing down from the mountains. Mud sucked at his boots with each step, threatening to pull them off as he navigated the treacherous terrain. The flashlight beam bounced wildly across the turbulent water and debris-strewn banks. "Where are you?" he called out, his voice immediately swallowed by the storm's fury. Another cry answered him, weaker this time. John aimed his light toward the sound, scanning frantically until the beam caught something small and trembling. There, clinging desperately to a half-submerged log being battered by the current, was a tiny, sodden form. The weathered man waded deeper, ignoring the icy water that now reached his knees. His flashlight revealed what appeared to be a small animal, its fur matted and dark with water. It was barely hanging on, its tiny claws dug into the softening bark of the log that had momentarily saved it from being swept away. John's heart, hardened by years of isolation, skipped a beat. Whatever this creature was, it was fighting to survive with everything it had, just as he had done since losing everything that mattered. Without thinking further, he pushed forward against the current, determined to reach the struggling animal before the raging creek claimed another life. The beam of John Smith's flashlight revealed a small, pitiful form half buried in the churning mud. A bobcat kitten, no bigger than his hand, struggled weakly against the elements that threatened to claim its life. Its once beautiful fur was matted into dirty clumps, its tiny body trembling violently from cold and fear. What made John's breath catch in his throat wasn't the kitten's desperate condition, it was its eyes. Those eyes, which should have gleamed with the wild fire of a predator, were clouded over with a milky film. The kitten turned its head at the sound of his approach, but its gaze remained unfocused, staring blindly into the darkness that would never lift. John knew immediately what this meant in the unforgiving wilderness of Montana. A blind predator was as good as dead. "Poor little thing," he muttered, crouching closer. The kitten hissed weakly, a pathetic sound that barely carried over the howling wind. Its instincts told it to fight, but its strength was nearly gone. John hesitated, his weathered hand hovering above the struggling creature. The merciful thing might be to let nature take its course. He'd seen enough death in these mountains to know how cruel survival could be, especially for the vulnerable. The storm would finish what it had started, and the suffering would end by morning. But then, unbidden, his late wife's voice whispered through his memory, as clearly as if she stood beside him in the rain. "Mercy isn't a choice, John. It's a duty." Catherine had lived by those words. Even in her final days, when pain had hollowed her out, she'd insisted on saving every creature that crossed their path. The injured sparrow, the orphaned fawn, the ancient dog nobody wanted. Her compassion had been the light in his life, and when she died, that light had dimmed to nearly nothing. "Damn it, Catherine," he whispered, rain mixing with something that might have been tears on his face. "You never did make things easy." Against every instinct hardened by years of solitude and loss, John gently scooped the shivering kitten into his large hands. It was so light, barely there at all, its heartbeat fluttering against his palm like a trapped moth. The creature didn't fight him. It had no strength left for resistance. John tucked the tiny bobcat inside his coat, against the warmth of his chest. "All right then," he murmured, turning back toward the cabin, each step heavy with mud and memory. "Let's get you home." As he trudged through the storm, the kitten's faint purr vibrated against his heart, the first sound to penetrate the silence that had enveloped him since Catherine's passing. John didn't know it yet, but this single act of mercy would soon change everything. John Smith carried the tiny, trembling bundle into his cabin, closing the weathered door against the howling Montana wind. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the crackling fire cast a warm glow across the worn floorboards. With hands that had grown unaccustomed to gentleness, he carefully dried the bobcat kitten with a soft towel, his calloused fingers moving with surprising tenderness. The small creature didn't resist his ministrations. It was too exhausted, too close to death to fight. Its matted fur gradually fluffed under John's careful attention, revealing a delicate frame that seemed impossibly fragile. When he finished, the kitten curled into a tight ball near the hearth, its tiny body still shaking despite the warmth. John sat back on his heels, studying the animal with conflicted eyes. Those clouded, sightless eyes told him everything he needed to know. The kitten was completely blind, a death sentence in the wild. Predators needed their vision to hunt, to survive. Without it, this little one was doomed. Maybe it would be kinder, he muttered to himself, thinking of his rifle leaning against the wall. A quick end would spare the creature a slow death by starvation or becoming prey itself. Nature was brutal that way, unforgiving to the weak and the damaged. He'd seen it countless times during his years in these mountains. The strong survived, the weak perished. It was the way of things. His late wife had always argued with him about that, insisting there was room for mercy in the natural order. The kitten stirred, sensing the heat from the fire. Despite its blindness, it turned its face toward the warmth, whiskers twitching. Its small pink nose worked the air, and it made a feeble attempt to stand, legs wobbling before collapsing again. But it kept trying, pushing itself up once more with a determination that seemed almost human. Something shifted in John's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The stubborn will to live in this tiny, broken creature struck a chord in him. He recognized that same stubborn persistence in himself. The refusal to give up, even when life had taken everything that mattered. "All right then," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "We'll give you a chance." The retired outdoorsman reached for an old flannel shirt, folding it into a makeshift bed beside the fire. Gently, he transferred the kitten to this softer nest, watching as it immediately curled into the fabric, its breathing finally steadying. John settled into his armchair, keeping vigil as the storm raged on. For the first time since burying his wife, something had cracked open inside his guarded heart, something that felt dangerously like hope. John Smith rummaged through his kitchen drawers, searching for something that could help feed the tiny creature. His fingers closed around an old eyedropper his late wife had used years ago. The memory hit him with unexpected force. Catherine kneeling in this very cabin, patiently feeding a wounded fawn they'd found trapped in barbed wire. "Small sips," she'd instructed him then, her voice gentle but firm. "That's how you save a life." He warmed some milk on the stove, testing the temperature on his wrist just as Catherine had shown him. The blind bobcat kitten lay trembling in its makeshift bed, tiny paws kneading the air, its clouded eyes searching for something it couldn't see. John approached carefully, cradling the fragile body in one weathered hand. "Easy now," he murmured, surprised by the tenderness in his own voice. He hadn't spoken to another living thing with such care since Catherine's passing. The kitten's nose twitched at the scent of milk. When John placed the eyedropper near its mouth, the tiny creature latched on with unexpected vigor, pulling desperately at the liquid. Milk dribbled down its chin as it drank greedily, its entire body seeming to come alive with each swallow. "Slow down," John whispered, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "There's plenty more." He refilled the dropper 3 times before the kitten finally seemed satisfied. Its belly now slightly distended, the tiny bobcat attempted to clean itself, paws moving in clumsy, uncoordinated swipes across its face. The sight stirred something in John's chest, something he'd thought long buried beneath years of isolation in the Montana wilderness. After the feeding, he gathered soft towels from the linen closet, arranging them carefully in a cardboard box. He positioned it near the fireplace, close enough for warmth, but not so near that it might overheat. The retired outdoorsman worked methodically, creating a nest that would cradle the vulnerable creature through the night. When he finally placed the kitten in its new bed, it turned in circles before settling, its tiny body curling into a tight ball of spotted fur. John watched as its breathing gradually slowed, becoming deep and even. The storm outside continued to rage, rain lashing against the cabin windows, but inside, a fragile peace had settled. He sat in his armchair, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, unable to tear his eyes away from the sleeping kitten. Something unfamiliar bloomed in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since before Catherine's illness took her. It took him a moment to recognize it. Hope, flickering like the flames in his fireplace. Small, but undeniably present. Dawn painted the Montana sky in gentle hues of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the previous night's fury. A fragile peace settled over John Smith's cabin as the storm's remnants dripped from pine branches and glistened on wet grass. Inside, warmth from the dying embers in the fireplace created a cocoon of safety. John knelt beside the makeshift nest of towels, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he prepared the eyedropper with warm milk. The blind bobcat kitten stirred, its cloudy eyes blinking unseeing at the world, but its nose twitched at the scent of food. It was a miracle the tiny creature had survived the night. "That's it," he murmured, watching as the kitten latched onto the dropper with surprising strength. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" The quiet moment shattered as the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel cut through the morning stillness. John's shoulders tensed instantly, his body reacting before his mind could process the intrusion. Few people ventured this far into the mountains, and fewer still came to his door. Setting the eyedropper down carefully, he moved to the window. A black pickup truck, polished to a shine that seemed out of place against the rugged landscape, had pulled up in front of his cabin. John recognized the vehicle immediately, and his jaw tightened. Robert Johnson stepped out, his expensive boots hitting the mud without hesitation. The wealthy rancher owned most of the neighboring land, thousands of acres that dwarfed John's modest property. Even from a distance, his purposeful stride betrayed his mood. Robert's reputation for ruthlessness preceded him throughout the county. He was known for getting what he wanted, regardless of who stood in his way. John glanced back at the kitten, now curled up again in its nest. Whatever Robert wanted, it couldn't be good. Their last encounter had ended with thinly veiled threats after John refused to sell his land, the final piece Robert needed to complete his hunting preserve. Heavy footsteps approached the porch, followed by 3 sharp knocks that seemed to echo through the cabin. The kitten startled at the sound, its tiny body trembling. "I know you're in there, Smith," Robert called, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to command. John straightened his back, feeling every year of his age in his stiff joints. He moved toward the door, pausing only to cover the kitten's box with a light cloth. Whatever storm Robert Johnson was bringing to his doorstep, he would face it head-on. Some things were worth protecting, even from men who believed money could buy anything, including the right to decide which creatures deserved to live or die. Robert Johnson's sharp gaze swept through the cabin like a searchlight, lingering on the small box by the fireplace. The wealthy rancher's imposing frame filled the doorway, his expensive boots tracking mud onto John's worn floorboards. His arrival was no coincidence. In these mountains, news traveled faster than the wind, especially when it involved potential threats to livestock. "I heard something unusual washed up by the creek last night," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting answers. "My ranch hand saw your tracks heading that way during the storm." John shifted uncomfortably, unconsciously positioning himself between the visitor and the makeshift nest where the blind bobcat kitten slept. The retired man's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed concern. "What's it to you what I found?" John asked, though he already knew. Robert's 1,000-acre ranch bordered his modest property, and the rancher had never hidden his disdain for predators of any kind. Robert took a step forward, uninvited. These mountains have a delicate balance. I lose calves every spring to predators. His gaze fixed on the box by the fire. What's in there, Smith? The tension in the cabin thickened. Outside, the Montana morning was crisp and clear, a stark contrast to last night's violent storm. Inside, two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, John sighed. It's a bobcat kitten, blind, would have died out there. Robert's face transformed instantly, anger twisting his features. The rancher's fists clenched at his sides as he took another step forward. That thing's a threat, he spat, pointing at the sleeping kitten. Blind or not, it's a predator. You know what kind of damage they cause. John stood his ground, something hardening inside him. It's just a kitten. Today it's a kitten. Tomorrow it's killing livestock. Robert's voice dropped dangerously. You'd better get rid of it, or I will. The threat hung in the air between them. John felt a protective instinct rise within him, something he hadn't experienced since his wife passed. The tiny creature had awakened something he thought long dead. This is my property, John said quietly, and what I do here is my business. Robert's eyes narrowed. We've been neighbors for 15 years, Smith. Don't make an enemy of me over some wild animal that nature already rejected. The kitten stirred in its nest, making a small mewling sound. Robert glanced at it with undisguised disgust. You have until tomorrow, the rancher said, turning toward the door. Then I'm calling Fish and Wildlife. They'll take care of it properly. John Smith planted his feet firmly in the doorway of his cabin, his weathered face set with determination. The morning light cast harsh shadows across the porch as Robert Johnson towered before him, his expensive boots caked with Montana mud. I'm telling you for the last time, Robert growled, jabbing a finger toward John's chest. That predator is a liability. One call to Fish and Wildlife, and they'll take it off your hands, whether you like it or not. John crossed his arms, feeling an unfamiliar heat rise in his chest. For years, he'd avoided confrontation, retreated into his solitude after his wife's passing. But something about the wealthy rancher's threats ignited a spark he thought long extinguished. Go ahead, John replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Tell them how a blind kitten threatens your 1,000-acre ranch. I'm sure they'll rush right over. Robert's face darkened, his jaw clenching beneath his neatly trimmed beard. You think you're clever, don't you? This isn't about one kitten. It's about precedent. Today it's a bobcat. Tomorrow it's a whole den of predators killing my livestock. We both know that's not what this is about, John said quietly, memories of their past conflict flickering through his mind. The rancher stepped closer, lowering his voice. You made an enemy when you crossed me years ago. Don't think I've forgotten. A tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft mewling of the blind kitten from inside the cabin. John didn't flinch, didn't look away from Robert's cold stare. Those days are behind us, John said. This kitten stays with me until it's strong enough. That's final. Robert's hand twitched toward his belt, but he thought better of it. Instead, he spat on the porch steps and turned toward his black pickup. This isn't over, Smith. Not by a long shot. John watched as the vehicle roared to life, spewing gravel as it tore down the driveway. Only when the dust settled did he allow his shoulders to slump, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline ebbed. Inside, he leaned against the closed door, surprised by the sensation coursing through him. It wasn't just fear or anger. It was something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, defiance, life. The blind kitten stumbled toward his boots, drawn by his scent or perhaps the vibration of his footsteps. John knelt down, gently scooping the tiny creature into his calloused hands. Looks like we've both got a fight ahead of us, he murmured, feeling the kitten's rapid heartbeat against his palm. The numbness that had enveloped him since losing his wife was receding, replaced by a fierce resolve that both terrified and invigorated him. For the first time in years, John Smith had something worth standing up for. After Robert Johnson's threatening visit, John Smith found himself shaking with an anger he hadn't felt in years. He took several deep breaths before returning to the makeshift nest by the fireplace, where the blind bobcat kitten lay trembling. The confrontation had clearly frightened the tiny creature, its clouded eyes darting uselessly as it sensed the tension in the cabin. "It's all right now," John whispered, his weathered hand hovering uncertainly before gently stroking the kitten's matted fur. "He's gone." As the kitten gradually relaxed under his touch, John observed its cautious movements, the way it tilted its head to listen, how it used its whiskers to navigate the boundaries of the towel nest, the tentative paw steps testing each surface before committing weight. There was something painfully familiar in these careful explorations. Since Martha's death 3 years ago, he'd moved through his own life with the same hesitancy, the same fear of unseen obstacles. The cabin that had once been their shared sanctuary had become his fortress against the world, each room filled with memories he couldn't see past. "We're not so different, are we?" he murmured, watching the kitten find its way to the small dish of formula he'd prepared. Despite its blindness, it located the food with remarkable determination, lapping eagerly at the liquid. The retired outdoorsman felt an unexpected lump form in his throat. This wild creature, lost in perpetual darkness, still fought to survive. It trusted him, a stranger, a human, simply because he had shown kindness when the world had been cruel. John settled into his armchair, allowing the kitten to explore his lap. Its tiny claws pricked through his worn jeans as it climbed uncertainly up his leg. "Martha would have loved you," he said softly, remembering how his wife had always been drawn to wounded things. "She always said that healing comes from helping others heal." The kitten curled against his stomach, its small body vibrating with a tentative purr. John placed his calloused palm over its back, feeling the rapid heartbeat beneath his fingers. "We'll get through this together," he promised quietly, surprised by how much he meant it. "I won't let anything happen to you." In that moment, as the storm outside finally began to subside, John recognized the strange kinship he felt with this tiny survivor. Both had been cast adrift by circumstances beyond their control. Both were navigating a world that had become suddenly unfamiliar and threatening. But perhaps, John thought as the kitten's purring grew stronger, they could find their way forward together. Two broken beings helping each other heal. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows as John Smith finished cleaning the makeshift nest where the blind bobcat kitten slept. The tiny creature had survived the night, its frail body rising and falling with each breath. John watched it with a mixture of concern and wonder, still unsure what had compelled him to bring this wild thing into his home. A sudden scratching at the door broke the silence. John froze, his weathered hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Robert Johnson's threats from yesterday still rang in his ears. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. With cautious steps, John approached the door, weapon ready. He took a deep breath and pulled it open, prepared for confrontation. Instead, his eyes fell upon something unexpected, another bobcat kitten. This one was slightly smaller than the first, but appeared healthy with bright, alert eyes that stared up at him without fear. "Well, I'll be damned," John whispered, lowering his rifle. Before he could react, the newcomer darted between his legs and into the cabin. John spun around, watching as the kitten moved with purpose, its nose working furiously as it tracked a scent. The retired outdoorsman stood transfixed as the second kitten found its way directly to the box by the fireplace. What happened next made John's throat tighten with emotion. The healthy kitten approached its blind sibling and let out a soft chirping sound. The blind kitten's head shot up, its cloudy eyes widening. They touched noses, and then the newcomer began frantically licking and nuzzling its sibling, their bodies intertwining in a reunion that spoke volumes. Their family, John murmured, understanding dawning on him. These weren't random kittens. They were siblings separated by the storm. The healthy kitten curled protectively around its blind brother, their purrs filling the cabin with a sound John hadn't heard in years, the sound of companionship. He watched as the sighted kitten nudged the blind one gently, guiding it to stand, supporting its wobbling frame with remarkable patience. John sank into his armchair, overwhelmed. One wild creature was challenge enough, but two? Yet he couldn't deny the powerful bond between them, the way the healthy kitten refused to leave its sibling's side, how it seemed to understand exactly what the blind one needed. "Guess we're all in this together now," John said softly, his own words surprising him. For the first time since losing his wife, the lonely cabin felt less empty, filled with the quiet determination of two creatures who refused to abandon each other, no matter the odds. John Smith watched in quiet amazement as the healthy Bobcat kitten circled its blind sibling, nudging it gently whenever it strayed too close to the edge of their makeshift nest. The seeing kitten had positioned itself as a guardian, its bright eyes constantly alert, ears twitching at every sound. When John approached with the eyedropper of formula, the healthy kitten would step aside just enough to allow feeding, then immediately resume its protective stance. "You're quite the little sentinel, aren't you?" John murmured, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he stroked the guardian kitten's head. The blind one recognized his scent now, turning toward him with a soft, mewling sound that tugged at something long dormant in his chest. The responsibility of caring for two wild creatures weighed heavily on him. One had been challenging enough, but two meant twice the feeding, twice the vigilance. Yet watching their bond, the way the seeing kitten guided its sibling with gentle nudges and comforting purrs, John couldn't imagine separating them. They belonged together, just as he and his wife had once belonged together. His moment of peace shattered when the rumble of engines broke the morning quiet. 3 pickup trucks kicked up dust as they roared up his driveway, skidding to a halt in a deliberate show of force. Robert Johnson emerged from the first vehicle, his expensive boots hitting the ground with purpose. 2 other ranchers flanked him, men John recognized from town meetings but had never spoken to directly. "Time to end this nonsense, Smith," Robert called out, his voice carrying across the yard. The wealthy rancher's face was set in hard lines, his expensive jacket a stark contrast to John's worn flannel. John stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the approaching men and the cabin door. Behind him, the kittens had gone silent, as if sensing the tension. "3 of you against 1 old man and 2 kittens," John said, crossing his arms. "Seems fair." The shorter rancher spat on the ground. "Those predators killed 2 of my calves last month. Their mother, probably." "These are babies," John countered. "They can barely eat formula, let alone take down cattle." Robert stepped forward, his eyes cold. "Today it's cute kittens. Tomorrow it's full-grown killers. We've got businesses to protect." The third rancher, a heavy-set man with a weathered face, nodded. "Fish and Wildlife should handle this, not some recluse playing savior." John felt anger rising in his chest, but kept his voice steady. "I'm not releasing blind kittens to die, and I'm not handing them over to be destroyed. Not today, not tomorrow." Robert's jaw tightened. "This isn't over, Smith, not by a long shot." The 3 men retreated to their vehicles, but the threat lingered in the air like the dust from their tires. Inside, John found the seeing kitten standing protectively over its blind sibling, back arched and tiny teeth bared toward the door. "I know exactly how you feel," he whispered. Robert Johnson stood on John's porch, flanked by 2 other ranchers whose weathered faces mirrored the Montana landscape they worked. The wealthy landowner's jaw tightened as he gestured toward the makeshift enclosure where the Bobcat kittens nestled together. "Those predators kill calves." Robert spat, his voice carrying across the yard. "Each one cost me $3,000. Are you going to pay for our losses when those things grow up?" The other ranchers nodded in agreement. One of them, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard, stepped forward. "My family's been ranching here for 4 generations. We've always dealt with predators the old way." John Smith stood his ground, feeling a strange calm despite being outnumbered. The blind kitten mewed softly from inside, as if sensing the tension. Its sibling pressed protectively against it. "They're orphan kittens," John replied, crossing his arms. "One's blind. They're no threat to your 1,000-acre spreads." Robert's face flushed red. "You've gone soft, Smith. First you betray me years ago. Now you're harboring vermin that'll cost us our livelihood." The accusation hung in the air, heavy with past grievances John couldn't fully remember. He noticed how the ranchers' hands hovered near their belts, their postures rigid with barely contained anger. "The law allows for rehabilitation of wildlife," John said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "These kittens stay with me until they're strong enough to survive." The third rancher, younger than the others, scoffed. "And then what? You'll release them right back here to hunt our stock?" John met each man's gaze in turn. "When the time comes, I'll do what's right for them. That's all you need to know." Robert stepped closer, close enough that John could smell the coffee on his breath. "The county wildlife officer is my cousin. One call, and those cats are gone." "Make your call," John challenged, not backing down. "I've done nothing illegal." For a moment, the tension crackled between them like electricity. Then Robert turned away, gesturing for the others to follow. "This isn't over, Smith. Not by a long shot." The men climbed into their vehicles, engines roaring to life. As dust billowed from their departure, John's hands finally began to shake. He hadn't stood up to anyone like that since before his wife died. Inside, he knelt beside the enclosure, watching as the healthy kitten groomed its blind sibling. Their trust in him felt like both a burden and a gift. "We'll figure this out," he promised them softly, knowing he'd need help to keep that promise. The rancher's resentment would only simmer and grow. John realized he'd just declared war on the most powerful man in the county, and he had no idea how to win. The crunch of tires on gravel drew John's attention that afternoon. Wary after the confrontation with the ranchers, he peered through the window, rifle within reach. A forest green pickup truck rolled to a stop in front of his cabin, its engine quieting to a gentle purr before shutting off completely. A woman emerged, her movements deliberate and confident. Sarah Brown stepped out with a large canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. John watched as she surveyed the property with keen eyes before approaching his door. "Wildlife rehabilitation," she announced when he opened it, extending her hand. "I heard you've got some bobcat kittens that need assessment." John hesitated, his weathered face betraying suspicion. "Who told you?" "Small community," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "And Robert Johnson has been complaining to anyone who'll listen." Something in her steady gaze convinced him to step aside. The wildlife rehabilitator entered, her eyes quickly adjusting to the dimness of the cabin. When she spotted the makeshift nest by the fireplace, her professional demeanor softened. "May I?" she asked, already kneeling beside the box of towels. With gentle hands that spoke of years of experience, Sarah examined the blind kitten first, checking its clouded eyes, feeling its tiny ribcage, and testing its reflexes. The second kitten hissed protectively, but allowed her touch when John murmured reassuringly. "The blindness is congenital," she explained, her fingers moving with practiced precision. "It wasn't caused by injury. And this little guardian," she nodded toward the healthy kitten, "is likely its littermate. They're malnourished, but otherwise in decent shape considering." John watched her work, impressed by her expertise and the calm way she handled the wild creatures. "Can they survive?" he asked, the question carrying more weight than he intended. Sarah looked up at him, her expression serious. "With proper care, yes. But you need to understand something. Robert's vendetta isn't just about these kittens. He's been trying to eliminate predators from this valley for years. She reached into her bag, producing specialized formula and feeding equipment. I can help you care for them properly, document everything officially, give you legitimacy if fish and wildlife gets involved. Why would you do that? John asked, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah's determined eyes met his. Because standing up for something defenseless matters, and you're going to need allies. She gestured toward the window where the mountains loomed. Robert has friends in high places, but so do I. For the first time since the confrontation, John felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Sarah Brown sat at John's kitchen table, carefully arranging the supplies she'd brought. The morning light caught in her determined eyes as she explained the situation with practiced clarity. With the proper formula and documentation, we can protect these kittens legally, Sarah said, pulling out several forms from her weathered backpack. Fish and wildlife will need these records to ensure we're following rehabilitation protocols. John Smith nodded, watching as she demonstrated how to prepare the specialized formula. His large hands, more accustomed to rough work than delicate tasks, mimicked her movements with surprising gentleness. You'll need to feed them every 4 hours, she continued, handing him a small notebook. Record everything: weight, feeding times, behavior changes. Documentation is our best defense if Robert tries to involve authorities. The blind kitten mewed softly from its makeshift nest, its sibling protectively curled around it. John glanced at them, then back at the wildlife rehabilitator. I can't thank you enough for this, he said quietly. I wasn't thinking about permits when I found them. Sarah smiled, her expression softening. Most people wouldn't have stopped at all, especially not during that storm. She demonstrated how to check for dehydration and explained the legal protections for wildlife rehabilitation. As a professional, she could provide the legitimacy his rescue efforts needed against Robert Johnson's vendetta. I'll come by every other day to check on them, she offered, packing up her remaining supplies. But call me anytime if something seems wrong. John walked her to her green pickup, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd welcomed another person's regular presence in his life. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. I appreciate your help, he said awkwardly, but I don't want to drag you into trouble with Robert. That man holds grudges. Sarah paused at her vehicle door, her face serious. Robert Johnson doesn't own these mountains, no matter what he thinks. And standing up for creatures that can't defend themselves, she glanced back toward the cabin where the kittens rested. That's rarer than most people believe. As her truck disappeared down the winding dirt road, John felt a strange mixture of relief and resolve. He couldn't do this alone, and for the first time in years, he didn't have to. The responsibility of caring for these wild creatures had somehow connected him back to the world he'd been avoiding since his wife's death. He returned to the cabin, checking on the kittens, who were now sleeping peacefully. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they were safe, and that was enough. Sarah Brown arrived early the next morning, her green pickup crunching over the gravel driveway. She carried 2 large bags filled with supplies, special formula, medical items, and building materials for a proper enclosure. The wildlife rehabilitator's eyes lit up when she saw the kittens curled together in their makeshift nest. They made it through the night, John Smith said, relief evident in his weathered face. Sarah knelt beside the box, her movements gentle as she examined the blind kitten. This little one's stronger today, she observed, her fingers expertly checking its hydration and responsiveness. The healthy sibling watched protectively, never straying far from its blind companion. Together, they spent the morning constructing a secure enclosure in the cabin's warmest corner. John hammered the wooden frame, while Sarah attached the wire mesh, their work falling into a comfortable rhythm. The retired man found himself sharing small stories about his life before isolation, fishing trips, mountain hikes, moments that had long been buried under grief. My wife loved animals, he admitted, pausing to watch the kittens explore their new home. She would have done exactly what I did that night. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Mine too, she said softly. My husband, I mean. He was the one who got me into rehabilitation work. The simple exchange hung between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of parallel losses. Neither pressed for details, respecting the tender wounds that time had not fully healed. By afternoon, the enclosure stood finished, spacious, secure, with soft bedding and hiding spots that mimicked a natural den. The kittens settled in immediately, the seeing one guiding its blind sibling around the new territory. As dusk approached, Sarah packed her supplies, promising to return tomorrow with more formula. You're doing something good here, John, she said at the door. Not many would take this stand. After she left, John sat on his porch, watching the Montana sunset paint the mountains gold. But his moment of peace didn't last. Robert Johnson's threats echoed in his mind, feeling increasingly personal. The wealthy rancher's fury seemed disproportionate to two orphaned kittens. Unable to shake his unease, John grabbed his flashlight and walked his property line as darkness fell. Near the creek where he'd found the first kitten, something metal glinted in his beam. His blood ran cold. A steel trap, professionally set, with poisoned bait nearby. This wasn't about livestock protection. This was deliberate, calculated malice, aimed at the kittens, at him, at anyone who defied Robert's will. John stared at the trap, understanding with sudden clarity that the battle had only just begun. Those cats disappear, or I handle it my way. Robert Johnson's voice cut through the evening air, cold and threatening as it echoed from the tree line. John Smith stood motionless, his heart pounding as the wealthy rancher's silhouette melted back into the forest. The moon cast long shadows across the property, revealing the steel trap and poisoned meat Robert had carefully placed near the cabin. The discovery sent ice through John's veins. Not fear for himself, but terror for the innocent creatures now depending on him. His weathered hands trembled with a mixture of rage and dread as he knelt to examine the trap. The metal jaws gleamed in the moonlight, powerful enough to snap a leg bone. John had seen what these devices did to animals, the suffering, the slow death. He carefully disarmed it, his fingers working with practiced precision despite their shaking. You won't get them, he whispered into the darkness, as if Robert might still be listening. Not while I'm breathing. The poison bait was next, raw meat laced with something that smelled faintly chemical. John dug a deep hole with a shovel from his porch, burying the toxic offering where no creature could find it. As he worked, the blind kitten's face appeared in his mind, its clouded eyes somehow trusting him, despite knowing only darkness. Inside the cabin, both Bobcat kittens slept peacefully in their enclosure, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond their sanctuary. The healthy one curled protectively around its blind sibling, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. John watched them for a long moment, his resolve hardening. He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded before setting it by the door. Then he pulled out his smartphone, a device he rarely used, and took photos of the disabled trap and the spot where he buried the poisoned meat. Evidence. Sarah Brown had insisted on documenting everything. Sleep would be impossible tonight. John settled into his chair by the window, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. His thoughts drifted to his late wife, wondering what she would say about this situation. She had always been the brave one, standing up for what was right while he preferred to avoid conflict. This is just the beginning, he murmured to the sleeping kittens. The rancher wouldn't give up easily. This was more than a dispute over predators. This was personal, a vendetta years in the making. Robert Johnson had resources, connections, and influence in the county. John had only his determination and Sarah's support. Dawn was still hours away, but John remained vigilant. This dangerous game had only just begun, and he knew the stakes were life and death. The morning dawned with a heavy mist clinging to the Montana mountains. John Smith couldn't shake the feeling that Robert Johnson would make good on his threats. The steel trap and poisoned bait had been just the beginning, a warning shot in what was becoming an increasingly dangerous standoff. "We need higher ground," John muttered to the kittens as he packed a small bag with supplies. The blind bobcat kitten had grown stronger over the past days, its cloudy eyes somehow more alert despite their blindness. Its sibling remained vigilant, never straying more than a few inches from its vulnerable brother. John knew of a clearing about half a mile up the mountainside, secluded, protected by dense pine, and accessible only by a narrow trail that would be easy to monitor. He carefully placed both kittens in a padded carrier and began the steep climb, his boots digging into the soft earth with each deliberate step. The recent rains had left the trail treacherous. Mud clung to his soles, making each foothold uncertain. Halfway up, the path narrowed dangerously where it skirted a steep ravine. John paused to catch his breath, the carrier heavy in his weathered hands. Almost there, he reassured his tiny charges, taking another careful step forward. That's when disaster struck. His boots slid on a patch of slick mud, sending him lurching sideways. The carrier slipped from his grasp, hitting the ground with enough force to pop its latch. Both kittens tumbled out, the sighted one managing to claw its way to safety, but the blind kitten rolled helplessly toward the edge of the ravine. "No!" John lunged forward, his body acting before his mind could process the danger. His fingers caught the scruff of the blind kitten's neck just as it slipped over the edge. For one terrible moment, both man and kitten hung suspended over the drop, John's other hand desperately clutching at a tree root. Pain shot through his shoulder as he pulled himself and the kitten back from the brink. Rocks tore at his skin, leaving bloody trails down his arms and face. With a final, agonizing heave, he rolled away from the edge, the blind kitten clutched protectively against his chest. The tiny creature trembled violently, its heart racing against John's palm. Its sibling approached cautiously, making soft mewling sounds that seemed to calm the frightened kitten. "It's okay," John whispered, his own voice shaking as much as his hands. "I've got you." Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead as he gathered both kittens and slowly, painfully made his way back to his feet. The clearing would have to wait. Right now, they all needed to recover from their brush with disaster. Sarah Brown's green pickup rolled to a stop just as John staggered back to the cabin, his shirt torn and bloodied from the fall. The wildlife rehabilitator leapt from her vehicle, medical kit already in hand, her face etched with concern. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to support him as he swayed on his feet, the blind bobcat kitten still clutched protectively against his chest. John winced as she guided him to a chair on the porch. "Slipped on the trail. Almost lost this little fighter to the ravine." His voice was rough with exhaustion, but his grip on the kitten remained gentle. Sarah worked methodically, cleaning the deep gash on his forearm, while the healthy kitten circled anxiously around him, occasionally nudging its blind sibling with obvious relief. "You could have broken your neck," she scolded, though her touch remained tender as she applied antiseptic. "Wouldn't be the first time I'd fallen," John murmured, his weathered face softening as both kittens settled against him, their tiny bodies radiating warmth. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the porch as Sarah finished bandaging his wounds. In the stillness that followed, she hesitated before asking, "What happened to your wife, John? You never talk about her." The question hung in the air between them. For a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer, but then he exhaled slowly, his calloused fingers absently stroking the blind kitten's fur. "Cancer," he finally said. 3 years ago. Elizabeth loved these mountains more than anything." His voice cracked slightly. "She was diagnosed just after we built this place. Gone 6 months later." Sarah listened quietly as John spoke of Elizabeth's kindness, her passion for wildlife, how she'd once spent 3 weeks nursing an injured hawk back to health. The kittens nestled closer, as if sensing his pain, the blind one purring softly against his chest. After she died, I just stopped, John admitted. Stopped caring, stopped trying, until this little one showed up. He glanced down at the blind kitten, its clouded eyes somehow fixed on his face. Sarah reached across and squeezed his hand. You didn't stop, John. You just paused. As twilight deepened around them, John realized a truth that had been forming since that stormy night. In saving these vulnerable creatures, he was reclaiming pieces of himself long thought lost. The compassion Elizabeth had loved in him wasn't dead, just dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. I think, he said slowly, watching the kittens curl together in sleepy contentment, I'm finally ready to fight for something good again. Sarah's smile held understanding beyond words. Together, they sat in companionable silence as stars appeared overhead, the cabin no longer quite so lonely. Sarah Brown sat across from John at his kitchen table, her laptop open between them. The glow from the screen illuminated her determined face as she turned it toward him. I found something, she said, her voice quiet but firm. This vendetta Robert Johnson has against you isn't about livestock or predators at all. John Smith leaned forward, wincing slightly from the wounds he'd sustained saving the blind kitten. What do you mean? Sarah pulled up old newspaper articles and wildlife management reports. 3 years ago, Robert tried to organize an illegal hunt for a mountain lion and her cubs that were living near the eastern ridge. According to these records, someone reported him to Fish and Wildlife before he could go through with it. John's weathered face hardened with recognition. That was me, he admitted. Charlotte, my wife. She loved those mountains and everything in them. We spotted Robert setting up bait stations. Charlotte insisted we report it. So this is personal, Sarah said, understanding dawning in her eyes. He's not afraid of 2 orphaned bobcat kittens threatening his cattle. He's punishing you for standing in his way before. John nodded slowly. The mountain lion family disappeared after that. I always hoped they just moved on. They did, Sarah confirmed, showing him another report. They were tracked moving north into protected land. Your intervention saved them. The wildlife rehabilitator reached across the table, her fingers briefly touching John's scarred hand. We need to be smart about this. Robert's not going to stop. Together, they formulated a plan. Sarah brought special feeding formula for the kittens and showed John how to document their growth and development with her digital camera. They applied for temporary wildlife rehabilitation permits, creating a paper trail that would make it harder for Robert to interfere legally. Every photo, every record of their care goes into this file, Sarah explained, setting up a secure folder on her device. If Robert tries anything else, we'll have evidence of a pattern of harassment. As evening approached, they checked on the kittens in their secure enclosure. The healthy one curled protectively around its blind sibling, both purring softly in their sleep. You know, Sarah said quietly, what you're doing here matters. Not just for these two, but for everything your wife believed in. John watched the sleeping kittens, feeling something long dormant stirring in his chest. Charlotte would have loved them, he said simply. Outside, the Montana mountains stood silent sentinel as darkness fell, and somewhere in the distance, a truck engine growled to life, heading toward John's cabin. The flames roared through the night, illuminating the Montana sky as Robert Johnson's act of desperation consumed John Smith's barn. The wealthy rancher had finally snapped, his vendetta pushing him beyond reason. John and Sarah Brown scrambled to gather the bobcat kittens, their hearts pounding as embers rained down around them. We need to document everything, Sarah shouted over the crackling inferno, her phone capturing video evidence as they fled. The blind kitten trembled in John's weathered hands while its sibling pressed protectively against it. They raced toward Sarah's pickup, the fire casting long shadows across the property. John's throat tightened as he watched years of memories burn. Yet the precious weight in his arms reminded him what truly mattered. The wildlife rehabilitator started the engine just as headlights cut through the smoke, Robert's black truck blocking their escape route. "You're not taking those vermin anywhere," the rancher snarled, stepping out with a rifle clutched in his hands. His face, twisted with hatred, reflected the dancing flames behind them. John stood his ground, sheltering the kittens against his chest. "This ends tonight, Robert. You've gone too far." What none of them noticed was the steel trap Robert had set earlier, the same type he'd hidden near John's property line. As he advanced toward them, a sickening snap echoed through the night, followed by an agonized howl. The rancher collapsed, caught in his own illegal trap. Moments later, red and blue lights flooded the scene as police vehicles and game warden trucks arrived, responding to Sarah's earlier call about the threats. Officers surrounded Robert, documenting his illegal trap and the burning barn, while paramedics tended to his injury. "We've been building a case against him for weeks," the lead game warden explained, reviewing the evidence Sarah and John had meticulously collected. "This is just the final piece." 3 months later, John stood on a sunlit ridge, watching as Sarah opened the carrier doors. The kittens, now stronger and larger, hesitated at the threshold of freedom. The blind one had adapted remarkably, its other senses compensating for what it lacked in sight. Its sibling remained ever vigilant, their bond unbreakable. They bounded into the wilderness together, disappearing into the underbrush with only a backward glance. "They'll be okay," Sarah said, her hand finding John's. "They have each other." John nodded, feeling a peace he hadn't known since losing his wife. In saving these creatures, he'd found something he thought forever lost: purpose, connection, and the courage to care again. As they walked back to the vehicle, John glanced at the foundation of his new cabin, rising from the ashes of the old. Robert faced charges for arson and wildlife violations. His influence finally checked by justice. "Compassion always costs something," John said quietly, "but it gives back more than it takes." Sarah smiled, understanding the truth in his words. Together, they'd proven that even in the darkest storms, mercy could prevail over vengeance, a lesson as wild and enduring as the Montana mountains themselves.